This is build 2.0.10.353. And what we have here is a basic lexical decision task. If you've taken our ePrime Basic webinar, this is the task that we have at the very end of the webinar. Now if you take a look at this, there are two places where you can tell ePrime addition. The first place is on the very top of the window here. It says ePrime Professional. This means that I'm using a professional edition of the software. However, if you look at the experiment object here, it says standard. This means I'm using a standard edition of this experiment. So, while I have Professional eStudio, I'm still using ePrime Standard to create this file. Now if you notice that I have ePrime Standard, you notice that there are a few things that aren't the same about ePrime Standard. So for example, this eRun test feature is not available. We also have other things that are not available in Standard, like Script Sense and Toolbox Defaults. So to convert this from Standard to Professional, you'll want to go ahead and save this as a Professional experiment. Now keep in mind that once you save a standard experiment as Professional, you can't save it back to Standard. This is one of the caveats of ePrime Professional. So I recommend using Standard if you are collaborating with other labs that may be using ePrime Standard as well. And this is something that I would ask the other labs. Now if I would like to save this as a Professional experiment, let's go ahead and click on File and click Save As. Now here you have Basic Lexical Decision. What we're going to do is we're going to take Basic Lexical Decision and we're going to save it to match the name of the experiment that we're going to create. So this is going to be Intermediate Priming Task. Now, most important part is the Save As type property here. If you look at the Save As type, it says ePrime 2.0 standard files. This means that this file is saved as a standard file. If I would like to change this, simply click the drop down and select Professional. And if I click Save, I'm going to get this prompt. This prompt lets me know that I'm converting from Standard to Professional. If I convert to Professional, I will have all of the features that Professional affords this. However, I will not be able to open this in ePrime Standard. So I'm going to go ahead and click Yes to convert this file. So now if you see at the top of my structure window, it says Professional. And if you take a look up here at eRun Test, you can see that this feature is now available. So now we're going to go ahead and actually edit this experiment. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn this from a lexical decision task to a priming task. And I would like to go over my hypothesis first. As I mentioned in the ePrime Basic webinar, I don't actually like editing my experiments until I know exactly how I'm going to edit them and exactly what is going to change. So first, in my priming task, I would like participants to be primed with either a red image or a green image. These images are going to act as our primes, and I'm going to tell participants that a red image is more likely to be paired, if we look at our try list here, with a non-word, and a green prime is more likely to be paired with a word. That's how we're going to do our priming. My hypothesis is that when primed with a red image, participants will be more likely to anticipate a non-word. So this means that the reaction time values that I get at the end of the experiment are going to be much smaller when the prime is congruent with the stimulus type. If a green image is paired with a word, and if a red image is paired with a non-word, my RTs should be much lower than if a green image was paired with a non-word and a red image was paired with a word. So let's familiarize ourselves with the structure of this current experiment for a little bit. The first thing we have is our instruction screen. Welcome to the experiment. You will be shown a fixation followed by a stimulus. If the stimulus is a word, press 1. If the stimulus is a non-word, press 2. Press spacebar to begin. These are okay for now. I'm going to have to edit these eventually. Next I have my fixation. This will have to be changed to add a prime, and we're going to do this by loading an image into ePrime, and I'm going to demonstrate how to do that. Next I have my stimulus. It's just a simple slide text sub-object in the middle of a slide object. And finally is the feedback display object. This doesn't have to change at all. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to go ahead and edit the instructions. So double-click on the instructions text display object to open it in eStudio's workspace. Right now it says, welcome to your experiment. You'll be shown a fixation followed by a stimulus. If the stimulus is a word, press 1. If the stimulus is a non-word, press 2. We want to change this to actually add our prime. Add a row of text just beneath this line to include my prime. So if you see a green image, the stimulus will likely be a word. If you see a red image, the stimulus, let me try this again, I'm just not gonna. If you see a red image, the stimulus will likely be a non-word. Press spacebar to begin. Now that sets up the pattern of responses that I expect from participants, and it sets up the prime. So let's go ahead and click on Properties Pages, and click on Duration Input. I'm doing this just to verify that the timing is exactly what I want. So the duration is set to infinite, and the keyboard allowable is set to space. This means that this instruction screen is going to stay on the screen as long as participants need it to. So at this point, if you would like to catch up, please feel free to pause this recording now and do exactly what I had done. This demonstrates how to edit a text display object and verify properties on a Duration Input tab. Now that we've changed the instruction screen, let's go ahead and exit out of that. And let's take a look at the next thing that we have to change. The next thing that we're going to change is we're actually going to change this trial list object. Right now it has dog and cat and these two non-words as our possible stimuli. However, that's not enough. That's only 4 samples. I would actually like this to incorporate many more words. I would like this to have a pool of 6 words and 6 non-words, of which the experiment only chooses 2 at random per participant. What I could do is I could make a huge list, and I could have 12 different entries, and those 12 different entries would have to be paired with my green stimulus and my red stimulus, and this would actually make this trial list look quite large. However, if we would like to reduce the size of this trial list but still get that nice cross-section, all we need is a nested list. Now a nested list allows you to create a cross-section of variables without having to write out a very large list object. They're created under this nested column. Our nested lists, in this case, are going to hold all of our 6 possible stimuli for words and all of our 6 possible stimuli for non-words. So to create a nested list, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to demonstrate 2 methods for creating a nested list. The first method is to take a list object from the toolbox, drag it into the workspace, and release. As you can see, the list object is created, and it's created in the unreferenced eObjects section. To edit this, all we need to do is just simply begin editing the list. So we'll go ahead and click Add Attribute, and this attribute is going to be called StimText. Now it's important that this attribute lines up with the name of this attribute in the trial list object, and I'm going to show you why very soon. Now what this is going to do is this is going to hold all of our words. So let's go ahead and add multiple levels by clicking this Add Multiple Levels button at the top of the list object. And the number of levels that I would like to add is 5. That way I have 6 possible selections. And I will go ahead and type in 5 words. So I'll do dog, cat, hat, dad, bat, and car. These are my 6 possible words that E' can choose from during my task. Now the next thing I want to do is I would like to change 2 properties about this. First of all, and this is something that I like to mention in all of my webinars, I believe that its name should reflect its function. Right now it says list 1. This tells us what it is, but it does not tell us what it does. So let's click on list 1, right click, and click rename. You can also click F2 if you would like. Instead of list 1, let's type word list and hit enter. This changes the name to word list. The next thing I want to do is I want to change it from sequential selection to random selection. As you can see here, my stem text contains dog, cat, hat, dad, bat, and car. If E' is only choosing 2 of these, then E' is only ever going to show dog and cat, and it will never get to the remaining 4. I would like each participant to randomly receive 2 of these 4 stimuli. To change that, click on the Properties page icon at the top of the word list, click on the Selection method, and instead of sequential, we will select random. Now, before I move on, this order property is something we have a lot of users asking about. And as you can see, we have a couple of these that sound almost identical. So I'm going to go ahead and go through each one of these possibilities. So the first one we have is sequential. Sequential will display stimuli in the order presented on the list object. Next, we have random. Random will randomize each list object, crossing that particular selection off whenever it is used so it is not used again. Random with replacement does not cross a value off when it is selected, so the possibility of repeating that stimuli again is very real. Counterbalance allows you to randomly select only one level from your list object and display that to participants. You can counterbalance by subject or by session number. Offset works much the same way as sequential does. However, this will randomly pick a number to offset by. So, for example, if the offset number is 2, E' will run through the list in sequential selection starting with 2, and will go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Permutation works a lot like randomization. It picks a random number and then presents the stimuli at random based on that number. For now, we will just select random. The next thing we want to do is move to our Reset Exit tab. Since we're only going to show 2 samples, let's change this exit list to after 2 samples. You have the possibility of going through cycles. So a cycle is one run of the entire list, or however much you define a cycle using this reset sampling or define cycle category, or you can have this list terminate after a certain amount of numbered seconds. So if I would like participants to see as many of these as possible in 10 seconds, I can simply change this to after 10 seconds. However, that's not what we want for this paradigm. So we will have this exit the list after 2 samples. So once we've done that, let's go ahead and actually nest this list. So we have this word list here that's currently in our unreferenced object section. It is not nested in the trial list. However, if we would like to nest it, all we need to do is under our nested column, type the word list and hit enter. If I hit enter, over here in the structure window, you can see that my word list jumped from the unreferenced object section to just under the trial list. All I need to do is type word list into the first 2 rows of this list object. That way, E' knows that in these first 2 trials we are only referencing the word list. The only possible way that we could get a non-word is if I were to also nest a non-word list in there. So I'm going to demonstrate how to create a non-word list now. Now the first method that we used to create a list was to drag a list object from the toolbox and open it in the workspace here. Another method to create a nested list is just begin to type the name of a nested list into the nested column. So I'm going to type non-word list and hit enter. E' will say that non-word list does not exist. Would you like to create it? I click yes, and when I click yes, pay attention to the structure window. As you can see, it changed from a question mark to a list object. This means that it created a nested list for us. So under this next row, I will type non-word list. And then let's go ahead in the non-word list and let's make roughly the same changes. So let's go ahead and click add attribute, and the attribute is going to be called stimText. We will add 5 levels to this, and the 5 levels that we will add will be 5 non-words. Once we've selected 6 non-words, let's change the same properties. So we'll want to go into Properties page here, click Selection method. Our order is going to be random again. And for Reset Exit, we're going to exit after 2 samples. Click out of this. And now we have our word list and our non-word list already set. Now the only thing we need to do now is to delete this stimText attribute. Since we have the stimText attribute referenced in these nested lists, there and there, and there, we do not need the nested list on this trial list. This is a mistake that many E' users often make. So let's go ahead and highlight the entire attribute by clicking on the stem text word, and then let's click Remove Attribute. It will ask if we are sure, and we will click Yes. Now keep in mind that the stimulus object is still going to be able to get the value of stem text and will still resolve properly to either a word or non-word, despite that attribute not being located here. Now I'd like to invite you to pause the recording at this point if you would like to catch up. This demonstrates how to make a nested list in two different ways. This demonstrates how to change the selection method of a list object, and it demonstrates how to change the number of samples that a list object will go through before it exits. While we're editing the try list, the next thing I want to do is I would like to add our prime. We do not have a prime in here. So we're going to go ahead and click Add Attribute, and this is going to be called Prime Color. Now, if you notice, we have two prime colors. We have green and red. So I'm going to type each one of them in the prime color. So we have green and red, and then I'm going to highlight both of these, take this fill handle here, and fill in the remaining two. And as you can see, it copies those two and fills them in below. So I have green and red as my prime color. Now I would like to make one more attribute. This attribute is going to be used for data analysis purposes. So go ahead and click Add Attribute, and my attribute will be called Congruency. And I will hit Enter to add it. This congruency attribute is going to let me know if the prime color matches a word or a non-word, just like in our instructions. So it says if you see a green image, a stimulus will more likely be a word. So I will call that a congruent condition. And if the participants see a red image, they're more likely to see a non-word. So I'm going to call this a congruent condition. This means that my remaining two conditions, so when word is paired with a red color and when non-word is paired with a green color, this means that this is going to be an incongruent condition. Now, there's only one more thing we need to change about this try list. If we read our instructions again, it says, if you see a red image, the stimulus will likely be a word. If you see a red image, the stimulus will likely be a non-word. If we take a look at our list, E' actually has a very equal opportunity to present a green prime with a word and a red prime with a word. So those instructions aren't quite correct right now. However, we can alter this list object very quickly and very easily to accommodate that. To do that, let's change this weight property. We will change the weight property for only the congruent conditions, so there is a higher probability of these two being paired together. So let's go ahead and change the weight from 1 to 3 and hit Enter. As you can see, the number of samples actually jumped. So if I keep this at 1, it says the number of samples is 4. However, if I change this to 3, I've added 2 more samples, so now the number of samples is 6. Since E' is going to run for exactly 1 cycle, this means that the number of trials that will be presented will also increment. So I'm going to do the same for my congruent list. I'm going to do the same for my non-congruent condition. I'm going to do the same for my red prime condition and change that to 3. So now my congruent and incongruent conditions have different probabilities of being presented. Now, if you'd like to pause the recording at this point and you would like to catch up, what this has demonstrated is how to add an attribute that is used only for data logging purposes, i.e. the congruency attribute. It also demonstrates how to create an attribute of prime color, and how to change the weight of a trial so it is presented more than one time. Now that we've finished our trial list, let's go ahead and X out of this. Now all we need to do is add a prime. So to add a prime, let's go ahead and take a slide object and we will put it just after fixation in the trial procedure. Now in this instance, we're actually going to delete the fixation. We're going to delete the fixation because instead of a fixation, we'll have a prime object. So go ahead and click on fixation and it'll jump down to unreferenced D objects. If you click delete one more time on unreferenced D objects, you'll get this error message that says this action will remove all unreferenced objects and will be destroyed forever. Would you like to proceed? Aside from being a little over the top, this is actually a very true error message. So go ahead and click yes, and it'll go away from our unreferenced D objects. So for our slide 1 object, let's go ahead and rename this from slide 1 to prime, just so the name follows the function. Let's go ahead and double click on it to open. Now that we've opened it in the workstation, we would like to add an image to this object. Just like how we added a slide text sub-object to this stimulus in the basic webinar, let's go ahead and add a slide image sub-object to the prime object. Doing this is extremely similar. All you do is click slide image once, move your cursor anywhere on the screen, and click. And now I've created an area in which an image can be displayed. Now, if we click on the sub-object properties page, we can actually start to edit these. The first thing I want to do is I would like to associate a file name with this. Now what I can do is I can load an image directly. So I can click this open folder here, and I can click on green, and look, if I click apply, you can see that it shows up there. And if I go ahead and click on red and click apply, you can see that it shows up in there as well. Now, if you notice, there's something a little odd about these primes. Not the entire image is being shown. We can actually fix this by changing the stretch property. If we set the stretch property to yes and click apply, watch what happens. The image is actually stretched to fit the area that I define. So this is a way to get the images to fit in a very specific area despite their size outside of ePrime. Now if you take a look at this, you notice that it's looking a little out of proportion. He's looking a little more squat than usual. To fix this, what we'll do is we'll change this stretch mode property. Right now, it is set to both. However, if I set it to only left and right, you can see that the top of his head and the bottom of his feet get cut off, but if I change it to up-down, you'll see that he's now directly proportional. Whether you use stretch mode both up, down, or left and right is completely dependent on the images that you're using. There's no one right or wrong choice for this. It is entirely dependent on the images that you're using and the paradigm that you're using to present them. So, loading the images in this way does a very good job of loading one image at a time. However, I'm going to need to switch between red or green depending on the trial. So to do this, I'm actually going to delete the name red here, and instead of the name red, I'm going to make an attribute reference for my prime color attribute that I made on my trial list object. So I'll do a square bracket, I will type prime color, I will end my square bracket. As you can see, it turned blue because it is an attribute reference in ePrime, and if you take a look here, what I have is .bmp at the very end. This means that ePrime is going to concatenate .bmp onto either red or green, which would appear after this prime color attribute resolves itself. You notice that all I put in my trial list was red or green. This is so I can now tack this .bmp at the end, and it actually creates an entire image. So if I click apply, watch what happens to that little image now. It changes to our little slide image sub-object icon. However, it is not only in grayscale. Since it's not in grayscale, this means that there is an image associated with this particular slide image sub-object. Now the last thing we want to do is change the position here to center on both the X and the Y properties. Go ahead and click apply. And I would like to change the size to 50%. And click apply. Go ahead and click OK to save these changes. And the last thing I would like to do is just edit the very simple properties of this object. So let's go ahead and click on the properties page icon, click on the duration input, and let's change the duration to 500 instead of 1000 to match that fixation object that we deleted. So let's go ahead and click OK. Now please feel free to pause the recording at this point if you would like to catch up. What this demonstrates is two different methods for loading an image object into ePrime. It demonstrates how to resize an image object, how to change its aspect ratio, and how to get it to stretch to fit an area that you've defined. So before we move on from our prime object, I would like to demonstrate one very cool feature of ePrime 2.0 Professional. and that is something called Toolbox Defaults. You can get to Toolbox Defaults by right-clicking in the toolbox and clicking Toolbox Defaults. What this Toolbox Defaults property allows you to do is it allows you to preset the default value of every object in eStudio. So for example, let's say that when I'm editing my task, I find that I'm always changing the text of a text display object from a font of Courier New to a font of, let's say, Arial Unicode. If I make this change every time, then that starts to get very old and it starts to be very monotonous, tedious, and time-consuming. However, if you change it using Toolbox Defaults, every time you create a new object in E' of that type, so every time I create a text display object in this instance, it's going to actually present a default font of Arial Unicode. Now keep in mind that this Toolbox Defaults does not actually travel between experiments. So if I'm making an experiment here, my lab mate who's making another experiment who uses an entirely different set of defaults is not affected by mine. However, if you find that you do have default values that you really like, what you can do is you can import from another .es2 file all of the defaults that you like. So let's say I'm making multiple experiments at a time and I always like my font to be Arial. I don't have to go ahead and change all of these. I don't have to make all of these changes every time I'm trying to make an experiment. All I have to do is simply click Import, find an ES2 file that contains all of my favorite defaults, and import that one. There's also the option to reset defaults if you would like. Now one thing I do want to mention is not only does this contain all of our E-objects, if you scroll to the bottom, this also contains all of our slide sub-objects as well. I can change the font of a slide text sub-object as well as change the font of a text display object. So this is just a nifty feature in E', just in case you were ever wondering. So now that I have my prime set up, this is actually all I need to do a simple priming task in E'. However, I would like to change this a little more. So right now we have our feedback display object here. This is our pre-formatted feedback object in E', and it's very serviceable. However, I want to change this to create a customized feedback. I would like this feedback to be whatever I want it to be. So this also demonstrates how to do contingent paradigms in E' as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this feedback object just like I did my fixation. So click on it once and click delete, and then click on it on referenced objects and click delete as well, and destroy it forever. Now I'm going to want to add a slide object to the very bottom of my trial procedure. Let's rename this object from slide 1 to feedback and hit enter. Now let's double click on it to open it. Now this object here is pretty blank. It's not exactly the kind of feedback that we want, so let's edit this to actually be something that we want. Now if you remember the feedback display object, it cycled through different slide states to display the type of feedback that it wanted. We're actually going to do this in the exact same way. So right now we have one slide state called default, and we don't have any more. Let's go ahead and add another slide state. This is also blank, but we have one called default and one called slide 1. When thinking about slide states, I always like to think about it like pages in a book. All of the slides are kind of like books, and each of them have a different page. The slide state is just whichever page you would like to show participants at this time. So, since we're sticking with the convention that the name always follows the function, let's rename our slide states so they actually reflect the function. So instead of default, let's go ahead and click on this slide subobject properties page at the top here, and let's name default to correct. That way, this is the slide state that actually displays when participants respond correctly. Then let's move over to state 1 and click on the subobject properties page icon, and let's change the name from state 1 to incorrect and hit OK. So this is going to be the slide state that appears when participants answer incorrectly. Now at this point, these slide states can be edited to show whatever you would like. They could have, let's say, a buzzer play during the incorrect. They could have the sound of applause play during the correct. Anything that you'd like. Just for the sake of this webinar, we're going to put very simple text in here. But please know that these can be easily edited to do whatever you want. So let's click on slide text, and we will add a slide text. And this one's just going to say something very simple like congratulations. Now when I type a long word like this into a very small slide text subobject like this, you can see that it kind of truncates my word. It's only showing me the middle part of congratulations. Now one thing I can do is I can resize it using these little pull handles here. I can also resize it by clicking on this slide subobject properties page icon. Click on frame and resize the frame using these height and width properties. So let's go ahead and change the width to 50, and we'll change the height to, let's say, 25, because it doesn't need to be very tall. Now if I click apply, it resizes. And I want to change the position, of course, to the center. Now if you would like, also feel free to change the font from something like Courier New to something more exciting. We can do Comic Sans. And we can go ahead and change bold to no. And click apply. So it looks nice and fun there. And if you want, we can also change the general tab. And if you change the forecolor of this object to blue, you will see that the text changes color. Now let's do something similar to incorrect. So for incorrect, let's add a slide text subobject. Let's click on the subobject properties page here, and let's go ahead and edit the text to say incorrect. We'll hit apply. It still truncates it a little bit, so let's jump over to our frame tab. We will change our width to 50 and our height to 25. Our X and Y positions will still be center. And we'll go to font, and we will change this to something a little more dramatic looking, maybe Forte. And then the general tab, we will change the forecolor to red. So now we have two very different incorrect and correct conditions. And let's check on the properties page here by clicking on the properties page icon at the upper left hand corner. Click on the duration tab, and 1 second should be enough. So let's click OK to dismiss this. Now if you would like to pause and catch up at this point, what the feedback object demonstrates is how to create multiple slide states. It demonstrates how to create different font for slide text subobjects, and how to change the forecolor or font color of slide text subobjects. Now that we've made our feedback, let's take a look at the one property that's most important here. If we click on Properties page, it's this active state. This active state property says that the correct tab is always going to display to participants. So this means that every time they run, regardless of whether they've responded correctly or incorrectly, they're always going to see congratulations. We want this to be active feedback, so we're going to have to write a little bit of inline script. To do that, let's close out of this feedback window. We'll grab an inline object, and we'll put it just between stimulus and feedback in the trial proc. Now, like every object in ePrime, I would like to change the name of this to reflect its function. So this is going to be process accuracy. And hit enter. Let's double click on this to open it in the workspace. What we'll have to do to actively change the slide state. Now what we will have to do to actually change the active state of the feedback object is to do what we call a simple if-then statement. Keep in mind that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the scripting aspect of this today, but if you would like to learn more about scripting in ePrime, we have a wonderful series of basic, intermediate, and advanced webinars that handle everything that you could ever want to know about scripting in ePrime. So while I'll give a very basic, very brief overview of scripting, this is not the highlight of the webinar, but is in fact the highlight of a fantastic series of webinars. So if you would like those, please feel free to purchase those. So what we're doing for this is just a simple if-then statement. So what an if-then statement is it's called a conditional statement. So if something proves to be true, or if something evaluates to true or false, then we can have something else happen, which is where the name if-then comes from. Obviously, to start an if-then statement, we will need the word if. So now we need to gain access to the accuracy of the response to the stimulus object. To do that, all we do is type the name of the stimulus object, so in this case, stimulus. Then let's click dot. Now what you see is something that we've incorporated into ePrime called ScriptSense. It actually allows me to quickly view all of the available properties of this object. So for example, if I wanted to know which one this was, I would hover this over ACC and it says reflects the accuracy of the response logged by the input object. Well, that's exactly what we need. So instead of typing .acc, all I need to do is hit enter, and ePrime fills this in for me. So now I have ifStimulus.accuracy. So I need to now remember the two different ways that ePrime logs accuracy. It either logs a correct or an incorrect, and in this case, it's correct is a 1, incorrect is a 0. This is how ePrime logs accuracy. So let's do our correct condition. So if stimulus.accuracy equals 1, this means that the participant has responded correctly to accuracy. Then, and now we have our conditional statement. So if this condition is met, what is going to happen? We'll do feedback, just so ePrime knows that we're talking about the feedback object, dot, and now we're going to want to look at active state. Active state, if we look here, it says sets or returns the active state of the slide object. This means that we can actually set which state between that correct or incorrect state that we present to participants. So let's show this active state. So let's click enter. So feedback.activeState, and to set it, I'll have to click equal, and then in parentheses I will type the word correct. So now, if stimulus.accuracy is 1, or if the participant responds correctly, feedback.activeState equals correct, which means that participants are going to see this correct slide state. All I need to do to finish this is write the opposite statement. So I will type else if, which just means otherwise, if stimulus.accuracy, so stimulus.acc, equals 0, which is the only other thing it could be, then feedback.activeState equals incorrect. And I will type a quick end if statement right there. So now all this does is it gains access to the one property of ePrime that we are most interested in. In this case, it is the accuracy of the stimulus object, and then it changes the active state of the feedback object depending on the participant's response to this stimulus object. So this concludes the script writing portion for this part of the webinar. If you'd like to pause to catch up or to go over anything that I said, please feel free to pause the webinar at this point. Once we've done our process accuracy inline object, let's go ahead and X out of this. Now, as we can see, our prime, our stimulus, and our feedback are all set up exactly how they should be. The next thing I would like to do is I would like to actually add a block of practice trials. Now, to create a block of practice trials, we actually have a couple of different methods in ePrime. The first method would be for me to create this trial list, these nested lists, and all of these objects again. And this would take another hour of the webinar, and as you can probably see from the timer at the bottom, there's less than an hour in the webinar. So I'm not going to do that. There's actually a faster way to do this. The first thing to do is double-click on the block list. In the block list, let's go ahead and add one more level, and this procedure, instead of block proc, is going to be called practice block proc. And hit enter. As always, ePrime is going to say that the procedure does not exist. Would you like to create it? I'm going to click yes. Now if you take a look at this structure window here, you can see that the block proc is on the top and the practice is on the bottom. This means that ePrime is going to actually run the practice trials after the critical trials, which doesn't really make sense and isn't fair to our participants. So what I can do is I can actually move the practice block above the block proc. To do this, click on the 2 in the ID column so that you're highlighting the entire row. Click on it once more and hold the mouse button down, and then move the cursor up. As you can see, there's this red line that appears at the very top of this list object. If you release the mouse, you see that the practice block comes before the block proc. Now, if I look at my structure window, I can see that this isn't necessarily reflected over here. So the change I made here doesn't look the same over here. To make this match, what I would do is click once in the structure window, just in the white space off to the side here, and click F5, and watch what happens. What clicking F5 does is it refreshes the structure window. So now my practice block appears above my block proc, which is the correct order. So go ahead and X out of this. Now if I double click on practice block, I notice that there's not really anything here. So I need to change that. What I can do is I can actually copy and paste all of these objects into my practice block and make them very quickly. So let's right click on trial list here and click copy. Click on practice block proc, right click and click paste. Now here's the important dialog. It says the object you are pasting contains child objects. Would you like to paste all of the child objects in addition to the primary object? If I click yes, what it's going to do is it's going to create a new instance of every object in this procedure. So not only will I get trial list 1, but I will also get word list 1, non-word list 1, prime 1, stimulus 1, process accuracy 1, and feedback 1. This means that I'm actually going to create a lot of new e-objects in ePrime. And this is actually way more than I need, since both of these e-objects that I create are going to be doing the exact same function. So let's go ahead and click no. Now if I click no, you'll notice that I did get a trial list 1. However, everything else remains the same. I have word list, non-word list, prime, stimulus, process accuracy, and feedback, none of which are auto-incremented with a 1 at the end, like my trial list is. Now let me show you what the effect of this is. Let's go up and edit the prime object in my practice procedure. Let's say a sound out object here. If I add a slide sound out object to this prime object, and I close it, this is my practice procedure, mind you. Let's move down to my actual procedures and double click on it. You'll see that that sound out object is in the prime object. And if I click on one, you'll notice that the other is bolded. This means that I now have 2 instances of the same object, and every change I make to this addition or to this instance of the object also changes this instance of the object. So only be sure to do this only be sure to do this method when you aren't planning on editing anything else about the structure at all, even if I would like to add a new slide object to my practice trials. So let's say I do that. As you can see, that slide that I created in my practice trials also appears in my critical trials as well. And we'll delete that because I don't actually need it. So this is kind of a double-edged sword. The benefit of doing this is you have fewer e-objects in ePrime. This increases your timing accuracy, and it makes ePrime have to load fewer objects, so your experiment just runs better. The downside to this is that you cannot make any more changes to this procedure of trials. Even these word lists, I now cannot change, which words are presented during the practice and which ones are presented during the procedure. The only thing I can change is this list object up here. So let's actually do that. So let's take our trial list 1 and we'll rename it from trial list 1 to practice list. And hit enter. And then in our practice list, we're actually going to change the weight from 3 to 1 for everything. That way it isn't weighted the same in our block proc. And let's go ahead and close out of this. Now please feel free to pause the webinar. What we just did was create a practice trial. This showed you how to copy and paste objects in ePrime. We showed you the difference between copying child objects and not copying child objects, and how to edit the weight value of an object. Once we've created a practice procedure in ePrime, the last thing that I want to do is I would like to get data about this whole run of the experiment. Now what we find is that people would like to get accuracy for the entire experiment. So how often did they respond correctly, how often did they respond incorrectly, and what was their overall RT for the entire experiment as opposed to just one block of trials. Now to do this, we're going to need to use something called a summation object. A summation object is a script-only object in ePrime that holds different values of data. So whichever data you specify, It then allows you to format and run different descriptive statistics on this data on the fly. So I can actually print out the mean response accuracy to my EDAT file without having to configure that elsewhere. Now, we did go over a little bit of scripting here when we did our process accuracy. However, if we need to do anything more intensive than that, and you actually don't really know where to start from, we have a great resource for scripting in ePrime. To find it, click on Help in the menu bar here, and click on eBasic Help. It should bring up this help program. eBasic Help is our repository of the entire eBasic language. This is where we keep all of our information on eBasic, and if you click through these folders you can see that there's quite a lot of it. eBasic Help is huge, and each and every one of these articles is really great. It contains an example, it contains the proper syntax for each one of these things, and it contains a brief description of what these are. So for example, if I'm using my Echo client and I would like to add an Echo client, we have the syntax at the top, a description, we have each of the parameters and exactly what they mean and what data type they are, some comments, and more importantly, and I think most helpfully, an example at the very bottom. So we're going to actually find one for a summation object. Now what we can do is we can, scroll through all of these objects here and try to find a summation one, but I recommend clicking on search as it's the easiest way to navigate through eBasic. And let's go ahead and in search, let's type summation. If you hit enter, you should see summation object right here. Let's click on the topic and we'll click on any one of these, let's say add observation. So our syntax is summation.addObservation, but more importantly let's look at the example here. So it tells you enter the following script into the users tab of the script window. So let's do that. Let's go into the script window, click view, and then script. Now the script window in ePrime, if you save or compile your experiment, like I'm going to do right now to demonstrate. So I save and then compile my experiment. As you can see, the script window is a full listing of all of the script of ePrime. So all of the objects that I have here are turned into script. And as you can see, even my script that I wrote is turned into part of the script. However, if I click on User tab, this allows me to define global variables. Global variables are variables that are used throughout the entire experiment. We of course go into this in more depth in our scripting webinars. The global variables that we would like to create in this instance are two summation objects. One summation object that handles accuracy for our entire experiment. The other one handles response time mean for the entire experiment. So I'm going to define a variable. We do this with a dim statement. Again, we go into these and much more in our scripting webinars. This particular variable is going to be called overall RT. And this is defined as, and you can see script sense again, a summation object. The next one is dim, and let's call this one overall ACC for overall accuracy. We will define this as a summation object. We have our two objects in our user script. Let's go ahead and jump back to this eBasic example. Now it says, enter the following into the post-stimulus inline object. Now what that means is this actually refers to a very specific sample that comes along with eBasic help, called eBasic help sample. Right here, eBasic help example.es2. Now what this is referring to is actually an example experiment that comes along with eBasic, called eBasic example.es2. They're very specifically named inline objects, but all we need to do is just create our own. So for this one it says post-stimulus inline, and this particular experiment, the post-stimulus inline is going to come right after instructions, and we're just going to call this one init. This just stands for initialize. Let's go ahead and double click on it, and let's refer back to eBasic help. As you can see here, eBasic help says set correct times equal to new summation. So this means I need to take my summation objects here, and I need to make them equal to new summations. So I will do set overall RT equal to new summation. This is basically just telling ePrime that I am now starting a summation object at the very beginning of the experiment. And I will do set overall ACC equal to new summation. There, now I have both of my summation objects set. So let's go ahead and look back in our eBasic help, and it says enter the following into the after inline object. So correct times dot add observation, and then the observation that I'm adding. So in this instance, if I look here, I'm going to add RT and ACC to both of these summation objects. So let's go ahead and double click on process accuracy. And just after my end of statement, let's hit enter twice. And I will type overall RT dot add observation. As you can see, that's the first one in script sense. So we'll just click enter. And the observation that I'm going to add for overall RT is stimulus.rt, as I'm accessing the reaction time value of the stimulus object. Similarly, I'll do overall ACC.add observation, and my observation will be stimulus.acc. Now, both my summation objects are being actively updated with the reaction time and accuracy value of my stimulus object throughout the entire experiment. So now that I'm doing this, I have to actually use it. So let's scroll down to the bottom of the experiment, and just before the goodbye object, let's put one more inline. This inline is going to be called report statistics. The purpose of this is going to be to take our two summation objects and put them into a usable manner. In this case, we're going to set them to the value of an attribute. So, like I set attributes in any of these list objects, I can also set attributes in script using the c.setAttrib statement. So I will do c.setAttrib. As you can see, it's highlighted there. The attribute that I'm going to set, I can either use this to update an existing attribute, or I can create a new one, which I'm going to do. This one is going to be called meanRT. And then a comma, and then I will want the value. So the value is going to be overall RT dot mean. The next one, I want c.setAttrib mean ACC, comma, and then the value I want is overall ACC dot mean. So it's going to take the mean of the two summation objects that I made and print it out here. Now, once I've done this, I can actually have this just print out the way that it's going to be. And for this one, I'm just going to get a number, and for this one, I'm just going to get a number. And they're not actually formatted. But there's an easy way to do that in E prime. So my mean accuracy, I would like to present as a percentage. So out of 100%, how many percent did they get correct? You can actually format this by using in E prime what we call the format function. The format function is accessed, and then type the word format, and then a bracket. Now, there are two properties of this. The first property is what you're formatting. The second one is how you're formatting it. Overall ACC is what we're formatting, so let's go ahead and click comma. And then the second property is how we're formatting it. Now we're going to format this as a percentage. E prime actually has a shortcut for this. You can access this by typing a quote there, typing the word percent, and doing a close bracket. So now E prime is going to format overall ACC.mean as a percent. So whenever I display this, it's going to say 100% or 50% or however well I did, instead of just a number. So let's do the same thing for meanRT. Now it doesn't make sense to display meanRT as a percentage, but it does make sense to present it in milliseconds with a leading 0. To do that, I would add my parentheses there again. I would add my quotation marks there again. Now to do this, I would add my quotation marks again. And the first thing I will do is my leading 0, and then a dot, because the 0 will represent the seconds, and then I just put two number signs after that. So now this is going to present this in a rounded up version in milliseconds. And I will put my last parenthesis there just to close that statement. So now that I've created those attributes, let's go ahead and reference them in this goodbye object. So I would click enter 2 times after goodbye, and I will put your overall reaction time was a colon and then an attribute reference. And as you can see, our mean RT is here. And then your overall accuracy was then a colon. And then as you can see, mean.acc is right here. So this is how we are able to take statistics in ePrime, actively collect on them, and then display them. And now that they're set as attributes, these are also going to display in our edat2 files at the end. So if you'd like to pause the experiment now, this demonstrates how to create a summation object in ePrime, perform very simple descriptive statistics on that, format them however you would like, and then use those formatted summation objects as feedback on any sort of object that you would like. So let's go ahead and close out of all these windows. So this concludes our eStudio portion of this webinar. What we're going to move on to now is the eMerge portion of the webinar. The eMerge portion of the webinar is going to demonstrate a more advanced way to merge your data files. So let's go ahead and begin by opening up eMerge. We'll dismiss a quick reference window. Now if I take a look at this folder, the one that you should have gotten as well, our data is actually presented by participants. So each participant has his or her own folder, and each folder contains all of the data for that participant. I know some labs like to put their data in this particular structure just to help clean it up. Now, let me show you the problem with this at first. If I were to click on the folder tree here, I click on my intermediate webinar, I don't see any data here. I don't see any of it, and when I try to merge it, there's nothing here to merge. Even though I have all of my data, and as you can see they're in this data folder here, I can only access them one at a time. So if I click merge, all that's going to merge is just one data file, and that's not a merge at all. So what I can do is something called a recursive merge. And you can get to recursive merge by clicking on this merge button here, and instead of standard, clicking on recursive. This actually gives you much more control over what is being merged. And what this does then is it not only checks the current folder, in this case our intermediate webinar folder, but it also checks every subfolder within that folder. So in this case it'll check data, participant 1, participant 2, participant 3, participant 4, and participant 5. It's going to check all of those subfolders for edat files and will merge all of them to the target location, which is our intermediate webinar folder, into one large data file. So let's go ahead and click next as on recursive merge. So it says select folder. In this case it's going to be our intermediate webinar folder. Then it says only merge files selected in the following format. I'm going to choose edat2. But if I wanted to merge two merge files together, I could do that. If I wanted to merge ePrime1 and ePrime1 files together, I could do that. If I wanted to merge ePrime1, ePrime2, and every type of data file under the sun, I can do that as well. In this case, I'm just doing edat2. Now, if you've ever merged data for a pilot study, or if you've ever preliminarily run data analysis and decided that you'd like to rerun a merge, you'd know that this is a little difficult to do because using that select unmerge button only highlights unmerged files. However, you can specify here that I can select never merged, already merged, or all files regardless of merge status. So if I do all files, regardless of whether these participant files have been merged into something else before, they'll get merged into my newly created file. So let's go ahead and click next, and in this I'm going to just call it intermediate merge. Intermediate merge, and click OK. Again, it says this does not exist. Would I like to create it? And I will click yes to create it. For number of files found, it actually searched all of my subfolders, and it found all 5 of my data files, and then files merged was 5, files not merged was 0. This is perfect. So let's click OK. So now we've merged all these files, let's go ahead and take a look at them. Let's go ahead and double click on intermediate merge, and there's all of my data. So now as far as data analysis is concerned, I want to demonstrate 2 things. The first thing is this arrange columns. We find that a lot of people end up using this. For arrange columns, let's go ahead and click on remove all. So now none of the columns show up in the edat file, and now I'll just get the columns I want. So I will show stimulus accuracy, stimulus RT, and let's go ahead and find that congruency attribute that we made, and click OK. So now we only see the accuracy, the reaction time, and whether it was congruent or not. Now if I want to, if I take a look at my data here, I find that I have quite a few outliers. So on the whole, the reaction time seems to be generally stable. However, if I have this particular value here, this 4 seconds to respond, that's really going to throw off my data in favor of an incongruent trial. I can actually filter this out. So if I click on Filter, first I find the column that I would like to filter. In this case it's going to be stimulus.rt. And then Checklist. So in Checklist I can select all of the values that I would like to filter out. So in this case I would like to filter out that 4,000 value, which is down here. There's a couple of them. This could also be done if you figure out what, so many standard deviations away from the mean are. You can filter it based on that. If I click OK, as you can see it only shows my checklisted ones. However, if I select all of them, and you can quickly and easily select all of them by selecting the first one, scrolling down to the last acceptable value, clicking Shift, and then clicking in the checkbox. It actively updates all of those. If I click OK, it'll then show me that, there we go, and I'll click Close. It then shows me all of the values that I've allowed and does not show me any of the ones that I did not allow. I can actually scroll down. See, the 4,000 values no longer appear. So now, if I click on Analyze, I should have a better idea of what this is without any of those outliers. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to name this analysis, and I'm going to show you why in a second. I'll name this analysis RT by congruency. Now what I'm going to do is I'll take stimulus.rt, and I will put it in my data. As you can see, this is going to be summarized by the mean, and I will find that congruent attribute, and I will make that the columns. Now I'm going to click Save Analysis, and I'm going to actually save this into my intermediate webinar folder called RT by congruency, and I'll click Save. So now this is actually very helpful. What a lot of people find that they do is they will run pilot subjects. They will analyze their pilot data just to make sure that the trends are favoring for their hypothesis. And then once they've run their pilot data, they can then apply this same analysis that they've run to their real data. Now, instead of figuring out what you did a couple months ago or a couple weeks ago after collecting your data, you can actually just load the analysis file that you want. Those are saved as .anl files. And if we double click on RT by congruency, it automatically fills everything in, including that filter that we placed on this data. So then if we click Run, we can see that congruent trials were actually much faster than incongruent trials. Therefore, my hypothesis was tested. This is great. So that concludes all of the content for the webinar for today. If you have absolutely any questions, please feel free to go to support.pstnet.com. We are more than happy to answer any questions that you might have there. Please feel free to try out any other of our wonderful webinars. They are all very well done, and they'll demonstrate very important properties in ePrime. So thank you very much for attending the webinar today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.